Okay, so now you should be all set.
They're great.
Fran, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Very professional.
Okay, I'm really glad to be here. This is a great day to be talking about gardens, right? And about wildlife, being nice and warm. So I thank all of you who actually came in here, and I like having a live audience to interact with and to be able to see what my impact is. I am a member of the Master Gardener Association of Cape Cod, and we are a group of people who love gardening and are trained by the Cape Cod Cooperative Extension to provide science-based, non-biased information about gardening topics to the general public. I will give you a little bit. I gave you a handout of my talks, sort of a summary and a resources list, and then a little half sheet of paper, if you're here, asking for feedback on my talk. So I always like to improve, and I forgot the list. I need to know how many people are here.
Want us to count off?
I just need to keep record because I need to give a report at the end. And I thought of the sign-in sheet, but that's okay. 12 people here, and I can find out how many are online. So this is wonderful. The Master Gardeners have lots of different kinds of programs. There is the Speakers Bureau, which I'm a member of. There is a horticulture clinic, mostly in the summer. There might actually be some horticulture clinic availability you could look into. Even in the wintertime, they have a spring symposium in March, which is going to feature Doug Tallamy. If any of you know Doug Tallamy is a great speaker and he's written a bunch of books about how to incorporate native plants into your environment for the benefit of the wildlife and the pollinators and so forth. So I encourage people to sign up for that when you can. I think it's going to fill up fast. Anyway, so, and then there will be other speakers and things in the event too. And then we have a plant sale in the spring and in May, and we have members, participants in the Hydrangea Festival and all kinds of things. So if you're interested in the Master Gardener Association, I encourage you to look into them and maybe become a member of the Master Gardeners. But so I don't want to spend any more time talking about that. I just encourage you to take part of it. And my thought was, I am not a Master Gardener by any means, but I did the training and I passed the training, and I love talking about teaching about gardening for wildlife because my background is that I'm trained as an ecologist, and I'm a longtime birder and a botanist, and I love wild things. So I bring them into my yard, and that's really great. Okay, so I want to talk about what kinds of wildlife we might be thinking about. What do we not want and need in the garden? Why we should garden for the wildlife as opposed to just for our own visual appeal or whatever, what they need, and then how you can create habitat in the yard. And then there's some resources. The resources page has more than my little slide thing about resources. So aesthetics are a big thing. Lots of people, how many of you are birders? Or bird watchers, or feed your birds in the garden, Okay, lots of people do that. So there's lots of people who want birds in their environment. And more people are getting interested in having pollinators in the garden. How many of you grow vegetables? A bunch of you. So you need pollinators for your vegetables, and all of the plants need pollinators. So, and then we eat, right? Plants support the pollinator, support the base of the food chain, and we eat all kinds of wild things, including lots of our fisheries. And game, some of you might go hunting for ducks and eat the ducks or deer or whatever is possible that aren't here. So pollination, pest control, decomposers in Detroit are where people don't think about, but you have them and you need them. And if something happens to decrease those, then we're gonna be in trouble. So there's lots of wildlife that is beneficial in your ecosystem. Why care about birds? This has a lot of the same kind of stuff, but I love that picture. My partner took this picture of this little bird trapped in a spider web. This was in New Jersey and tall in a tree, and you can see the web here, and his feathers were caught in that tree, and so he was like gonna be spider food, maybe. I don't know if the spider could have dealt with him, but anyway, Carol went around and found somebody who could come rescue the bird. So she escaped that one. But so they're the canary in the coal mine, and they're in trouble. We've lost billions of birds in the past 30 years, in the past, well, since 1970 is more than 30 years, 50, something anyway. But that's a huge decline overall, and some of the birds have declined much more than that. So the ones that are called at the tipping point are like 2/3 of their populations have declined, and some of those on the tipping point are some of the shorebirds that come to Cape Cod and sea ducks that we have here. Great black-backed gulls. How many of you know what that is? They're around, but they've declined a lot. So there are a lot of birds that are in trouble. Some birds have benefited from ecological or from conservation work. The ducks and geese have benefited because people who like to hunt birds have done a lot of work to preserve wetlands for them and so forth. So conservation works. Birds that haven't been paid attention to that much are in more trouble. Grassland birds are in trouble because we convert grasslands to lawns, or we convert grasslands to farm fields, or we convert grasslands. We do farming differently than we used to, so the edges aren't available the way they used to be, and so forth. So there's lots of things that we do that negatively impact a lot of the birds. And so the climate change obviously is on top of all of that. Habitat loss is what I was just talking about. Invasive species, introduced invasive species, replace native plants that have good food for them with other ones that don't have good food for them. Use of pesticides in our lawns and agriculture. I have read that there is more pesticide used on lawns than there is in agriculture because the agricultural fields, the farmers are they are running a business and they need to make money. They can't afford to spend too much on pesticides. And we want to have perfect golf course lawns. And this is the worst place in the world to try to grow a perfect golf course lawn because the soil is really acidic. It's really sandy, drains. You have to fertilize all the time. You have to add pesticides. You have to keep herbicides to keep the broadleaf grasses out, the broadleaf non-grasses out, so forth and so on. It's a lot of work. So don't try to make your yard a golf course. Convert it to something else that will be equally beautiful and beneficial for the wildlife. Rodent killers. Keep the animals out of your yard, out of your house. You can do that by blocking all the holes they come in by. And then don't poison them. Those poisons get out into the environment. The sick animals get eaten by hawks and owls and eagles, and they kill the eagles. And I've seen statistics like something like 85% of the birds that come into wild care or places like that are suffering from exposure to rodent killers that cause them to bleed internally. So, try to avoid doing all that stuff. Keep your cats indoors. They kill billions of birds a year. And make your windows so that the birds can see them. That particular bird is actually fighting with its reflection, so it's not hitting the window. But it can see its reflection. And so I put a bunch of tape on the outside. It has to be the decals or whatever have to be on the outside of the window. And they should be close together, so I made this grid and they didn't fly into my window anymore. Just put tape on the other side. So, anyway, so why do we care about pollinators and bees? And food needs to be, most of the foods we eat need animal pollinators. And this is all when I was being good about eating a mostly vegan diet. This is what I had in my kitchen one day. And lots of fruits and vegetables, herbs, all those things. And then the grains and stuff. And a lot of the grains are wind pollinated, so they wouldn't be as effective if the pollinator disappeared. But all the rest of it needs a pollinator. And this is vanilla that should have been taken off too, because we have so affected the vanilla. We've moved vanilla away from its natural habitat. So we have to hand pollinate it. Do you know that?
Mm-hmm.
We're animals too. So they've escaped, or they've taken it away from its natural pollinator, so it's not, you don't get vanilla without a pollinator. Anyway, so, but this is just looking at our personal self-interest. But if you think about the whole ecosystem as a whole, everybody eats. All the creatures around us eat. And their food also is largely animal pollinated. So even if they're not the pollinators themselves, they eat food that pollinators have created. And if we lose the pollinators, we're gonna lose animals. Pollinators are declining. There's all kinds of headlines about the insect apocalypse. Monarch butterflies are declining, but it isn't just monarchs. And bees are declining, and Rob Gagier at UMass has done a lot of research on bees, particularly bumblebees, and he runs this Beecology project, which is in your resources list. And for looking at low elevation parts of Massachusetts, when you look through the historical record, there were 8 species of bumblebees, which were relatively common to relatively uncommon, but there were 8 species of bumblebees in the low elevation parts of Massachusetts. But when he went to look for them and find current records of bumblebees, he found almost none or none of some of the species. And most of them had declined dramatically. This one, the Grisicolus, had held its own. And the one, Bombus impatiens, which is almost certainly the one you see when you are thinking bumblebees in your garden, it's one of the biggest ones, is a real generalist, and it can feed on all kinds of plants, including a lot of the introduced aliens, flowering plants we like to put in our gardens. And it is 3 times as common as it used to be. There's a broken scale here. This is 0.93 as opposed to 0.3 at the top here. So that's 3 times as common as it used to be before, more than 3 times as common as it used to be. So that one is benefiting, but most of them are declining. So things are in trouble. This is all because of land conversion, impermeable surfaces degrading the habitat that still exists, loss of native plants. Yard landscapes tend to be, and which is 30% of the US, is yards. And it is much less useful for wildlife, for pollinators, for insects than they used to be, because we make a monoculture of introduced grass, and then we keep it from flowering so that it isn't even producing seed for anything, right? And then we plant around introduced shrubs and trees and bushes and wildflower and flowers, not wildflowers, that don't feed them much. So pollinator loss can make the species loss in trouble. Here's a bird that crosses it's a bird and it's a pollinator, so that's kind of cool. We all love hummingbirds, right? And hummingbirds need nectar. So a lot of people will plant nectar plants for their for their hummingbirds, and these are great native nectar plants for your hummingbirds. I love those cardinal flowers, and this is a columbine, and Lonicera sempervirens is the trumpet honeysuckle, which is a native honeysuckle. It's one of the only ones. So I recommend that one. Instead of the Japanese honeysuckle, it's a vine. So forth. So there's a bunch of plants that are native that hummingbirds will use. They also feed on insects and spiders. They feed their babies bugs because the babies need protein, they need fat that is not there in the nectar. They need to feed their babies bugs. This is true of almost all birds. Feed their babies bugs or other kinds of animal food. Obviously, if you're an eagle, you're not feeding them bugs, but you feed them other kinds of animal foods. So you need not to have the pesticides in the environment that are killing off the bugs. Pesticides are not species specific. They do not, if you're spraying for ticks, you're killing all kinds of other arachnids, mites and other things. You have no idea what they do, but probably they do something important. So encourage the turkeys to come in and eat ticks, right? So anyway, so we need to have all kinds of creatures living in our environment. Pollinators, most of the pollinators are insects, and there's lots of different kinds. The one up here in the top left, top right, excuse me, is honeybee. Only one species of honeybee is introduced. It was introduced in the 1600s. It is not native. It is livestock, and it is very different from the kinds of bees that are native here. We think of bees as having big hives, making honey, producing thousands of babies every year, and the whole colony surviving the winter. That is not true of the other bees, of the native bees. And for the thousands of years that the indigenous people were here before we arrived, they were eating foods that were pollinated by native bees. And if we didn't have honeybees, our food could still be pollinated by native bees. In fact, some of our foods are native to the Americas, and they are better pollinated by bees, native bees, than by honeybees. Cranberries and blueberries and squash. And from South America, originally, the tomatoes and potatoes and peppers and things. So they are better pollinated by native bees. And notice the size difference of different bees. The bumblebees are big, and this is that that common bumblebee, which is the biggest one. This is a carpenter bee, which is actually a nectar robber. It steals the nectar without doing pollination always, but sometimes it does. And this flower is about an inch across or an inch and a half across. So that little bee, that's a little bitty bee. And if you go to, I don't know, I just saw a webinar by Sam Droege at the USGS. And he had photographs taken under microscopes of all kinds of bees, and he said they're the size of a rice grain. Imagine the size of a flower that those things need. So there's diversity, there's huge diversity. And he said last night that if you're in the East, you probably have access to about 100 species of native bees that could be in the vicinity of your neighborhood enough that they could come to your yard if you had something to attract them. So there's huge diversity of bees, and a lot of them are in trouble. Not only bees, there are beetles that are pollinators, there are bees that are pollinators, that's not a bee. Flies, that's a fly. Some of them look like moths or bees or whatever, and then there's some wasps, all kinds. Look at the numbers. This is for North America, but So there's lots of species. Bumblebee life cycle, just as an example of what native bee life cycles tend to be like. The queens hibernate after they've mated, and they're the only ones that survive the winter. So the mated queens are ready to start a new colony. They come out in the spring when it gets warm enough. They find a nest, maybe in an old mouse nest. They make a nest, they forage for themselves and lay eggs and feed the babies that they first have until they have a little bit of a colony maybe to help them. And then they keep laying eggs once they have workers to go out, but they don't make honey. And the colonies are maybe 200, small numbers, and some of the bees don't even have that many. It's like small numbers of offspring. They produce males in the fall, they mate, the whole colony dies except the queen. So that's really different from the way bees, honeybees do. But they need places to hide, they need places to hibernate, they need food, and a lot of bees specialize on particular kinds of flowers. So we know the butterflies, if people like butterflies, this is a monarch butterfly, and its offspring, the caterpillar, and we all know, what do the monarchs need? They need nectar, right? They can take nectar from a bunch of different plants, and they especially like aster flower plants, aster type, like sunflowers and things like that, that they can stand on and probe their, the tubular, these are all, this family of plants, all their flowers are actually a whole bunch of flowers. Each of these little strap-like petals is a flower. Each of the little tubular things is a flower, and each one produces a seed at the base. So like dandelion fluff, each one of those comes from a single flower, and what they're doing is putting their mouth parts into the deep in there to get nectar, and in the process they get pollen all over their body, and they spread the pollen around from one flower to another, which is really cool. It's important that they go from one flower to another flower of the same kind. That's really important for the plant. But what they need to lay eggs on a specific kind of plant, which is the milkweeds. So those butterflies need milkweeds, but other butterflies need other kinds of plants. Why? Because plants can't defend, they can't run away, right? They have to defend themselves somehow. They defend themselves by being terrific biochemists. They produce toxins that keep most of the insects and animals from being able to eat them, from being able to digest them. Makes it hard to digest, makes them distasteful, makes the animals sick. So the animals specialize. These insects have evolved to be able to survive milkweed poison, whereas a lot of the insects don't eat milkweed because they can't survive the milkweed toxins. And these particular ones take it even further. They not only can survive the toxin, they incorporate the toxin in their own body, so they are distasteful to birds. Really cool, right? Not all of them do that, but it's different plants then have different insects specializing on them. So fritillaries, like violets, and so it goes and goes. You can look up what kind of butterflies do you think you want to attract them, but you don't have to do that much work. You can just sort of use a generalist habitat or method here. So they all need a host plant, and they need nectar plants. Different ones need different ones. They have overwintering stages. They have a habitat for pupa. There are some butterflies that overwinter as adults, some as a pupa, some as an egg. So it depends on the particular butterfly. You don't have to be a butterfly specialist in order to know how to help them. If you take some general rules about how to do it. Some of them migrate and some don't. So they're adapted to local conditions. So one of the great things about native plants is they have been here for thousands of years, and they have evolved relationships with insects that have been here for thousands of years. So they're co-evolved to be able to deal with each other's chemistry or habitats. But the nice thing about plants too is that they don't need to be pampered because they like it here. They like our crappy soil. They like the sandy soil, the acidic soil, the low nutrient soil. They've evolved to be able to live here. You don't have to pamper them. In fact, they might.
Decides to throw the lottery out of the country.
Great, I'll bring my fountain back tomorrow.
If someone is online, if you could,
Could you please remove the wind chimes from our front door in case you hadn't noticed I'm rather tall?
I will try to talk over that. Anyway, my sister has really rich soil that was introduced. She lives in Somerville and her young, somebody imported
Yeah,
all
I
of
know
it.
this is much.
She can't grow the wine. Because the soil's not rich.
The wall.
Okay,
It's just a lot.
so you don't need fertilizer, you don't even need to water very much, because there's the
I
ones
mean,
that
there's
live
much as it did for me.
there are used to, once they're
Oh
established,
my God.
need to be.
It's right now.
Oh, you didn't know about it, yes.
Someone needs to be irrigated, because I don't know how to do that.
Okay, for 20.
Are you insane?
No, I flew it out till last night anyway. Write it down in your own handwriting, I'll get another one during free period.
Serious?
Yeah, it's not great. But it's just something that.
I can't believe this. You are saving my life right now.
Native plants, you're supporting the native creatures. And insect or bird food. So, insects are bird food. So there's some repetition in here. I apologize for pulling slides from a couple of different places. There was a study, Doug Tallamy did a study with birds, he and his students did a study with Carolina chickadees where they asked people in this area if they would mind putting up, if the researchers put up chickadee bird nests, bird boxes for a bunch of plants. And they had yards that had a lot of natives and they had yards that didn't have very many natives and they had a mixture of. And they discovered that if there were less than 70% of the biomass of the yard was native. If less than 70% was native, the chickadees failed to produce babies, or at least to fledge them. And some of them tried to feed, because they had seed available, some of the birds tried to feed their babies with seeds instead of caterpillars, but they all died. So that's biomass, so that includes trees. If you have trees that are native trees, that's a lot of biomass. You can have your hydrangeas, but if, so think about that and do the best you can to have that at least 70%. More than 70% is great, but none is worst. So one plant, if you can start with one native plant, it's better than nothing, right? So start small and keep on building. So when I talk about native, what do I mean? So some people use native to mean native to North America, native to the United States, native to Massachusetts, native to what? I don't know, this hemisphere. That's a lot of variation in that ecosystem. So what I do is I focus on my ecoregion. So I live on Cape Cod. I'm here in ecoregion 84, which is the Atlantic coastal pine barrens, which extends up into Plymouth County and the islands. It also is included in much of Long Island and southern New Jersey. A lot of that because they have the same glacial kind of history and glacial outwash and terminal moraine kind of ecosystem. And we're relatively close to the coast. We also have the wind-blown sand and the salt exposure and all those things that help to make us unique and different from the other two ecoregions in Massachusetts. And the ecoregion in the west of Massachusetts is a mountainous one, so it's going to be quite different. The soil is all different. It's more limey, so it's all different. And so if you've fallen in love with plants that grow in the forests of western Massachusetts, I say go visit and enjoy them out there, but you're not going to have a lot of success planting them and having them grow here unless it's one of the plants. I mean, there's overlap in the species, but the plants are not paying any attention to political boundaries. They are paying attention to what the environment is like. And some plants are really good at growing here. There are a lot of plants in the heath family that love it here. When you talk about plants, I use plant names. I use the scientific names often because it's important to know the scientific name, to know that you're talking, because common names can be anything. And I've got a couple of examples of where common names are different in different parts of the country. So these are all names of common oaks. White oak is the most common white category oak in our area. Quercus coccineus, scarlet oak, is very common. So we're in the oak pine forest, pine barrens, pitch pine, some white pine, mostly pitch pine, and different kinds of oaks, including this one, these two, Quercus alba and Quercus coccinea. We also have some English oak. People brought acorns over here and planted them. So we have English oak growing here and there in the towns. I've seen them in Venice. I've seen them at, anyway. So it's not native. And researchers have shown by genetic examination that they diverged probably 50 million years ago. So that's a lot of time for the oaks here to have a whole different bunch of insects eating them than eat the ones from Britain. So the English oaks are probably not as useful here. And in fact, somebody did a study with cherry genus, the genus cherry. They looked at the insects that were using non-native cherry here and that were using the native cherry here. And there was huge difference in the numbers. There were like a few maybe used the non-native cherries, but the native cherry does, so it matters. Okay, so growing native plants, again, you don't need to water once they're established. You don't need to fertilize. You can use green mulch. You can cover the ground mostly. There are some bees that like to have a little bare patches of ground. You can just kind of let that naturally happen. They don't have to be very big. Don't get all panicky about it. You don't have to put inches of mulch over everything. Grow plants that cover the ground, grow ground covers. This is a field pussy toes, which is kind of cool. Leave the leaves and stems, mow less. I'm gonna go say these things over again and recognize that the plants are gonna be damaged a little because they're being eaten, but that's important. And they're usually not damaged very much, and it doesn't affect the plants very much to be eaten a bit, but you're creating habitat. So I did this to reduce lawn input. Somebody gave me a bluebird box and I had bluebirds in it the first year, but they were really unhappy when I mowed the lawn. So I said, well, I won't mow the lawn. I will make a meadow around it. And that's what I did. And I try to mow it less in the summer. And I like the lawn flowers, and these particular ones are native. I actually introduced this and encouraged it. The wild strawberry is a native plant. It has tiny little, very flavorful, kind of seedy fruits, and I don't usually get very many because the birds like them. So celebrate the lawn flowers. Limiting fertilizers will help not only the birds that are in your local neighborhood, but they'll also help the birds that are in the wetlands, in the surroundings, in the ducks and so forth, because all of that's, everything you put on your ground goes into the water. And especially if you're not really careful with amounts, a lot of nitrogen fertilizers are very soluble when it rains. They leach down into the sand, and the sand here it's very porous. It flows into the water table. And there it is in the ponds. The biggest problem is our septic systems, but this contributes. You can easily you can't easily stop natural processes in your body, but you can easily stop fertilizing your yard because they don't need it if you plant plants that like it here. So all of these will help. Create layers and create strata and do a kind of feathering in to your yard from the woods, if you have woods on your border. Natural ecosystems, those that behind us is a woods. These woods are not very old. I have to remind you that Cape Cod has been denuded of trees at least twice since we were settled by Europeans. And one study that I heard about here they did cores of every tree in this park, and none of them were over 80 years old. So these are baby trees. They're young trees. They will never get big until you let them get old, right? So you have to take what we have and encourage them to get bigger, let them get bigger. Anyway, but most deciduous forests have canopy trees, and then they have understory, shorter trees that are often things like dogwoods and the amelanchier, the serviceberry, that stay small, or the young versions of the canopy trees. And then there are shrubs. So if you have all of those different layers, you get different kinds of habitat for different kinds of birds. So you have, and insects. So more height diversity gives you more birds. Native invasives, avoid them. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but you can look into the prohibited plant list, which is on your handout, that tells you what's invasive as opposed to just not native. So not native is one thing. Hydrangeas are not native. You have hydrangeas and geranium and tulips, and there's a bunch of things that are garden plants that are okay, but these are ones that escape. They may not move around in your yard and be troublesome to you, but they are producing berries that are getting eaten by the birds and spread into non-managed habitat and displacing native plants and causing problems. So they're called invasive. There are plants that I believe are invasive that nobody has actually officially called invasive, but the ones that have been are definitely problematic. And there's a whole committee in Massachusetts that decides which ones are native. So every state has that, and so does the federal government. So you can look up what's invasive. But these are some examples. They're not all of them, but these are some of the worst ones that I have encountered in this. Now called roundleaf bittersweet is.
That's the worst one.
That is bad, and you have to keep your eye out for it, so you have to learn what it looks like and pull it up when you see it. A lot of these are things that people planted on purpose because they were ornamental, so burning bush is everywhere, but it's a problem. So I've taken burning bush out of 3 properties now, anyway, so hopefully this is the last one because I don't want to move again. But anyway, Japanese barberry, I took this out of my dentist yard Most of the honeysuckles are a problem except for that one viney one that I told you about. There are native Lonicera shrubs, but they're not in the trade that I can find. And they're probably isolated to particular special habitats or something in nature, so, anyway, I won't go into further into that, but figure out what you've got that's invasive, take it out, replace it with a native, and that's a good start on getting started on it. Okay. Span this season, insects need, and birds need food from early on to all the way through the season. Some bees are only active during a particular short period of time when their specialist plant is available, but others are more generalized and they need food all year. So make sure you have things to work on, having something. Everybody wants to do that anyway, right? You want to have flowers all the time. Try to have at least 3 species at a time. This is the native, what some people call false lily of the valley, or I call it Canada Mayflower, is an early spring flower in the woods. And this is our state flower. You know what it is? What do you call it?
Primrose?
No, it's not a primrose.
The Mayflower.
It's the Mayflower.
It is.
What people here call Mayflower is not what in Virginia I called Mayflower anyway, so that's. Anyway, so that's one of the things about common names. This I used to call trailing arbutus, and my mother grew up with it in North Carolina and just loved it. It smells good. It's really on the ground. The name is Epigea repens, which means on the ground creeping, which is a perfect name, but it's down there on the ground and it smells great and it's early spring. It's wonderful. And then these are fall plants. Some of my favorites are the goldenrods and asters, just fabulous plants. Okay. Plant native fruit sources. If you're thinking about you want birds, a lot of people think about doing this, planting fruit sources. And here are some native ones. The Juneberry has flowers that's also called shadbush because it flowers in the spring when the shad are running. So it's an early one. And then it produces berries by June, which is early. So that's a cool plant to have. And it's really pretty and it's great just inside the woods or at the edge of the woods. It's a great place to have it. Bearberry creeps on the ground. It's a great ground cover, slow growing, but covers and holds the soil. It grows in all kinds of sunny places. Chokeberries, beach plums, hollies, native holly, the American holly is native, and there are some shrubby ones which are native. Those are all just dioecious, which means they have male and female plants separately. So in order to get the fruit, you have to have one of each. Or you have to, it doesn't have to be a 1-to-1, they don't get married. They just, there has to be a male around for you to get the berries on the female. Woodbine, Virginia creeper. This is great. If you put this instead of English ivy, take out your English ivy. I have a tree that's going to be cut down tomorrow because it was killed by the English ivy. And I spent a lot of money getting somebody to dig up the English ivy along their driveway and plant natives in there. Anyway, that's cool. So bayberry, love bayberry, right? Okay, next month, by the way, I'm going to be talking about native plants and taking people on a virtual field trip to different kinds of habitats on Cape Cod and showing you some plants that are native to Cape Cod. So I'll spend more time on the plants there, but these are examples of great plants that have fruit for birds. And then there are birds that eat seeds. So keep the ones that are already here, your native oaks and pines. Red squirrels love the acorns, not the acorns, the pine cones, the red pine cones. It's pine. And they pull off all the scales and eat the seeds. And they leave a little thing that looks almost like a pineapple. That's the empty husk. That was where the scales were attached. They're really cute. Anyway, acorns hundreds of species of insects eat the oaks, and some of them eat the acorns. Lots of birds, deer, all kinds of things eat the acorns. Blue jays eat the acorns and spread them as far as a mile away. Birches are great food for birds. Composites of various kinds are great for producing seeds that birds eat. And I put this in because there is a composite that gets a bad rap because of this. Does anybody know what this is? Little green flowers, tons of pollen that gets up your nose. This is ragweed.
Oh, yeah.
If you have what you think is an allergy to goldenrod, it is not goldenrod, it's this. Goldenrod has showy yellow flowers that attract pollinators all over the place. And those pollinators are carrying pollen from one flower to another. It's wasting its energy. It's not wasting. It's using energy to create those showy flowers because it's attracting pollinators. This doesn't do that. It doesn't have much in the way of showy flowers at all because it's producing tons of pollen that's dusty and flows in the wind. So they happen to flower at the same time. And nobody sees this because it's green, right? And grasses. One quick point about this thing, this is a non-native plant, but it shows a point. There's two different varieties of this cosmos here. One of them is a sort of old-fashioned kind of cosmos that has a lot of yellow in the middle of it. And those yellow flowers produce seeds, which goldfinches like. So cosmos is pretty. You can have cosmos, it's an annual. But if you don't get this doubled one, because they've converted all those seed producing flowers into non-seed producing flowers, so you get nothing. A lot of doubled flowers, they have a lot more petals, they're more showy, but they've reproduced, they've taken away the reproductive structures and converted them to petals, so they look nice, but nothing can use it. So that's an example of things where if you're looking for cultivars, pay attention to what they've changed on it to make sure that you're not making it less useful. And you can plant nectar sources. There's lots of plants that are nectar sources. This is just some examples. Attract invertebrate foods, because invertebrates are food for birds. So you want to attract, plant native plants that even if you don't know what eats it, the chances are there's an insect that eats it and there will be a bird that eats the insects. So these guys need insect food all the time. This is a swallow. The bluebirds go flying off to catch flying insects. This is a towhee, and then there's thrushes and things like that spend a lot of time on the ground hunting for things, and they need insects that will be on the ground. This is a Carolina wren. There's a couple kinds of wrens. So insects are bird food. And then there are some you can look up in different sites for pollinator magnets and hosts for particular kinds of butterflies, or hosts for butterflies in general. Some of the sites in the handouts, you can look up and specify, I want a plant that's good for butterflies. And you get a list of plants that are good for butterflies. So that's one strategy to use. Notice also this, though, that these are composites, and this is a composite, and there are some this is aster family plants. There's a big diversity, huge family. They all have these individual flowers that look like a big cluster, looks like a flower. And there are lots of them, and if in seed mixes, tends to be a lot of these. And some of them are great, they're great for butterflies. A lot of them are great, but they're not the only thing. If you're looking for a diversity of bees, you want to have a diversity of flower forms. And look at all this. There's another kind, and this is a mint. There's a lot of different kinds of mints. This is called mountain mint. One of the kinds of mountain mint, narrow leaf one. This is in the clover family. This is the wild lupin, which I am told lives at Fort Hill.
Yes.
I haven't seen it there yet, but I'm gonna have to go look for it next year. Anyway, this one is native to here. The garden lupin is not. And the plant, the Karner blue butterfly uses this one. And if it uses the other one, it doesn't survive. Unfortunately, they hybridize, and the hybrid is also not very useful to surviving offspring. So I took the garden lupin out of my yard when I planted this one in there. Of course, you can't say what your neighbors are doing, but, so that's a great one. Milkweeds are wonderful. This is another pea flower, this is the native version of Baptisia. There's a blue Baptisia that a lot of people have that is not the one that the native bees here need. They need this one. And then violets. Violets are free, right? Or practically free. And you get fritillaries. Okay, tolerate the imperfection. Here's your picture of the pussy toes. Ground cover. I saw this. What's going on with these leaves? Well, look at the caterpillar. The caterpillar's eating those. It's going to pupate, I think, in that clustered up leaf, and it turns into this. And this is the underside of the leaves. It was sitting on a rose, and it was on the sidewalk. Pretty red orange caterpillar, or flower butterfly. It's an American lady butterfly. And it likes pussy toes. Okay. Soft landings. A lot of things that butterflies that have caterpillars in the trees end up producing pupae that fall to the ground and spend the winter in the ground. And if you rake up everything around the tree, or put a ton of mulch under the tree every year, you're burying that or reducing the availability of overwintering sites. So you can do something that's even prettier than a pile of mulch. And that is, you can plant wildflowers around the bases of your trees. Choose one, depending on how much shade they create. They do create, trees produce shade, right? So you have to have at least somewhat shade tolerant. Find a plant that's shade tolerant, that likes it under your trees. This is white wood aster, which I love, or the Canada Mayflower. That's at the beech forest. Anyway, and then you don't have to break it, right? Just leave the leaves when they fall. They'll come up through the leaves in the spring. Makes it really easy, and it's pretty, and it makes habitat. Other kinds of nest sites include the stalks of some. These are fairly thin, so I'm not sure how much they use this, but many kinds of bees use the dead stalks, broken off stalks of old things. And this is bird food, right? Seeds. So what you can do is leave that stuff for winter interest in the fall. In the spring, if it's in the front of your house, you want to make it neat. Cut it a foot high and let the plant grow up around it. And the insects that don't have very big mouth parts can dig into anything that's got spongy kind of tip. They can use as where they nest. They can put babies in there. They can put eggs in there and develop into babies. So, but that is a potential resource for bees. Also, little bits of bare ground. Leave the leaves, leave the logs that are falling. Don't they make a nice background for something? And then the dead snags. Dead trees are habitat. They're really important. And if you can, I had one that died while I was living in Venice, and it was close to where I parked my car. So I had a tree guy come over and cut it to the point where it wouldn't fall on my car if it fell, but then I left the rest of it. So there's a 10-foot stump, and then the Virginia creeper grows up, and it looks pretty. And then the dead snags, dead trees are habitat. They're really important. And if you can, I had one that died while I was living in Venice, and it was close to where I parked my car. So I had a tree guy come over and cut it to the point where it wouldn't fall on my car if it fell, but then I left the rest of it. So there's a 10-foot stump, and then the Virginia creeper grows up, and it looks pretty. as it starts getting older and older, you're gonna get beetles in there, you're gonna get bugs in there, you're gonna get birds trying to eat the bugs, you're gonna get nests in there. It's gonna be really cool. So cavity nesters need that kind of thing. And there are a few birds that will use nest boxes, including the bluebirds and the chickadees. I have had experience with those, but a lot of them need to have a tree to have a cavity in. And the bigger the bird is, the bigger the tree it has to have, or the bigger the hole it needs anyway. This is in my sister's yard in Somerville, and she had this, it was a not a native birch, that was a birch, so, which was okay, but it died. And then, she had a tree guy come and actually tie it to the house so it wouldn't fall down. And that's a book that is, down to Rebecca making a hole in it. So she's so excited as she watches it decay over time. It's more and more lost its bark. It's really interesting to watch it. And it's, you know, it's a site of interest, so really cool. So choose the right plant for the right place, and doing natives is a big thing, but even among natives, there are some that like shade and some that like sun, et cetera, et cetera. So find out about them and get your soil tested by the UMass to find out what you've got. And then ignore the recommendations for fertilizer and stuff, because you're growing things that like that. So don't do the fertilizing, but find out what you've got. And then find out what likes that. Okay. You can find plants at nurseries. The more you ask local nurseries to have native plants, the more they will. There are some nurseries that specialize in natives, and some of the resources in your handouts have more information about that. So I'm going to go through that. Anybody have any questions?
So much information.
And kids for getting rid of bittersweet,
Yeah, so I don't know.
I pulled it out.
Yeah, I would say pull it out, cut it down. The first thing to do, the people that I had, take out the English ivy, they also got rid of some bittersweet, it's a challenge. But what they did was the English ivy in particular sticks to the trees, and it will actually damage the bark if you try to pull them off. So what they did was they girdled not the trees, but they cut out a section of the vine that was climbing, and then they pulled it out from the ground. And then it died, and it's losing its leaves, and it's, you know, gradually gonna look like nothing much. And, but, so you can do that, and, you know, your trees are tall and this stuff is growing up there, maybe you don't need to, I don't know, depends how big it is, and you can get professional help if you need it. I had in Dennis, I used to crawl under the holly trees, which kept getting stuff, and I would pull it down and pull it out of the ground. But you have to keep at it, and I would wander around and look for it every spring. I would start looking for it. And when I saw it, I would pull it up, learn what it looks like as a baby, and pull it up. I did the same thing with, there's garlic mustard.
Oh,
You
yes.
know what that is?
Yeah.
Okay, that can stay the seeds stay in the seed bank for 5 years or something. But I actually had success. I had a big patch of it. I pulled up as much as I could. Every spring, I pulled it up as whenever I saw it before it would flower, and it wouldn't get a chance to seed again. And over time, I got less and less and less of it. So you can, if you keep at it, keep pulling it up. I did the same thing with that Japanese knotweed. I had a big clump that had like 6 stems, 6 big clumps, and I kept pulling it up and kept pulling and or at least pulling all the leaves off of it. Pull all the leaves off it. What am I trying to say? Deprive it of green, because the green is what feeds it, and over time the roots will starve. if it never gets to have any green on it, if we pull off the leaves every time you see leaves, check it every couple of weeks. Okay, does that help? I know it could be, depending on what your situation is, it can be an enormous undertaking to get rid of invasive, but as much as you can do it, it's helpful.
I made a mistake of planting English ivy
Right,
unknowingly about 25 years ago.
yeah,
Two or three little strips
Yeah.
along my fence in my backyard. And it grew up beautiful, covered the whole
Oh,
fence.
yeah.
It was great.
covers the whole
But
thing, right?
Then it got under the fence to my neighbor's yard, up
Yeah,
the trees.
yeah. And unfortunately, my next door neighbor really likes the ivy that's all over their yard, and now I'm gonna have to I have a little walkway in between my yard and there, right at the border, and I'm gonna be keeping an eye on it I'm gonna patrol it every week. To keep the ivy out of my yard, because it'll come back. So, any other questions? Don't know if there's anybody online who has questions, and whether they are monitoring to know because they would be unsilent. Yeah,
Are there any garden areas that specialize in native plants?
are there garden centers that specialize? Yes, there are some, and, so I have gone to the Native Plant Trust in Framingham, there's the Garden in the Woods, and they sell native plants there. And they also have a facility in Western Massachusetts. There's one in Connecticut that I went looking for something in particular. I called around to people for a particular thing. There are some, like, Agway will have some, but they don't specialize in it.
I think the farm also has.
The farm may have some,
Yeah.
but they don't specialize in it, so you have
I know,
to.
yeah. But
You
they do
have
have
to keep an eye on that. And the other thing is, when you do ask them, one of the problems that people have had that have become evident is that some plants are treated with neonicotinoid pesticides, which are, what do they call it? They're absorbed into the plant, they're systemic. They're absorbed into the plant, and they are in all parts of the plant, including the nectar and pollen. And so they were meant to kill the leaf-eating insects, but they're killing pollinators too. So avoid plants that were treated like that. There used to be, sometimes it would advertise on the tag that it was treated, and that was great, so you didn't have to do this pesticiding yourself, and that's wonderful. I don't think they advertise it anymore, but ask. And if they can't tell you, find another place, because they should know whether those plants are in habit or not, because you're bringing it into your yard because it's persistent in the plant.
One more question. I have in one of my gardens on the side of the house, these, I call them weeds. I'm not sure if they are weeds. They come up in the spring, get about 3 feet, 3.5 feet high. They have a tiny little white flower, almost looks like a small aster,
Okay,
with a little yellow dot in the middle.
okay.
And I'm just wondering, they spread all over the place. If you don't pull them out, by
Okay,
the following year, they're all over the place.
I can't tell you what it is offhand. You might be right about flea bane.
I
But-
have them also.
Or fever. So one of the things that I have in the handouts is how to tell what something is. Personally, I have not had a lot of success with I do things, so I can't tell you which one is gonna be the best for plants. They may work on non-native plants. The problem is there are so many kinds of native plants. There are hundreds, thousands of kinds of flowering plants. So Wild plants are a problem for these sites. But there are books and there's an online key that you can, answer some questions about it and it might be able to find out what it is. The other possibility is iNaturalist. Anybody use iNaturalist? You can take a picture or several pictures of a plant. Sometimes it can, again, with plants, it's really good with insects and birds because it can identify, and there's lots of people on iNaturalist that identify plants and birds and insects. But with plants, again, you might have some success. But you have to have the things that a botanist would look for to be able to identify the plant, which may include the flowers, but also what does the whole inflorescence look like? What's the flower height or the plant's height look like? Does it branch a lot? Does it have hair on the leaves? Does it have hair on the stem? All these things are things that a botanist will look at depending on the kind of plant. So you have to kind of document carefully just to try it, but definitely explore iNaturalist as a possibility. Because sometimes if you have a good enough picture, somebody will identify it for you and say, this is iNaturalist, and it's listed in the list of resources on that page. And I like books, so I use Newcomb's Wildflower Guide as the first place to look for wild plants. I have more technical manuals, if I think it's maybe not one of those, but and it's really, if you can learn to use a key, it was the best thing I ever learned in college was how to use a key to identify something. So that's a sort of, that book has a relatively easy key to get started with. Any other questions? But I do encourage you, find out what you have in your yard already. Because if you already have a big hickory tree that's a native hickory tree, and you already have, pitch pine and scarlet oak and all these things that are good, leave them there and then find out what the weeds are and if they're invasive or just weeds, which maybe you can leave even if they're not native. And like, I don't worry too much about dandelions. They don't do a lot, but they do a little for wildlife. So, and I actually have clover in my yard. The other kind of wildlife you might get, besides birds and butterflies, is rabbits. Right? Lots of rabbits.
Fran?
Right, yes.
There's
Yeah.
been a couple of folks in the chat that have asked if it's possible for you to share the handout via email. Maybe you could give a copy to Monica, or maybe leave a bunch of copies there for the people that are virtual.
There are some copies here, and I did send a PDF of the handouts to the office.
Yeah,
So,
I will be able to
So
send it.
you can send it by email.
I'll send it
Yes,
via email.
definitely. Send those by email. That would be great.
You gonna
are
send
there-
it out, John?
Yes, I will. Yep.
Okay.
All the Zoomers, because I think everybody else has one here right now, right?
Right.
Okay, so I'll email it to the Zoomers right now.
Great, terrific.
Thanks.
Oh, please. This is just
Oh,
a
dear.
system thing.
I mean, another thing that, as a strategy, I would suggest, I talked to, I actually hired an ecological landscaper to put in a series of swales down my hill to try to catch the sun or to catch the rain and put some native shrubs in it. So I'm growing a thicket for sparrows and all kinds of cool stuff. So that was really cool. So he was good, but he said he had a client who was asking him to take everything out and start fresh and plant everything native. And I thought, oh my goodness, all the birds that are actually using whatever's there that might be native and using whatever's not native that's at least sheltered, right? It's going to be years before the plants get big enough to be of any use. So don't do it that way. First take out your invasives, find something to replace them, find a spot in your yard you want to work on this year and leave the rest away for a while, the way it is, and then over time, build and build. Gardens are always a work in progress anyway. So, you know, start where it makes the most sense to you, where you want to have a particular thing. Like I have an herb garden. I don't use herbs all that much, so in my new yard. So I'm gonna plant hummingbird plants on it because it's right next to the patio. So that's this year's exercise is find native plants for hummingbirds and put them in there and see what happens. So anyway, and even if you don't have any, you know, some people only have a patio, plant native plants in pots and whatever you can do.
My backyard is honeysuckle that's been there for 70 years. But you said there's only one kind, a viney kind?
There is a viney kind, so there's a bunch of shrubs, and I have had honeysuckle shrubs. Are they shrubs or is it a vine?
Well, I have both kinds.
Okay, so the most common vine is the one that has white flowers, and it's the kind that I used to suck on when I was a kid.
Yes.
Okay, so, and they smell great, right? So this is why people planted them, but they're a problem. So they are invasive. So I would work on getting rid of those. But you can replace the viney one. If you have a place for a vine, to replace it with the one that has the red flowers. The Lonicera sempervirens is the Latin name, or coral honeysuckle. And it attracts hummingbirds. So I'm gonna put some on my fence. The shrubby ones, you can find other kinds of flowering shrubs that are native. To confuse matters, there is something called bush honeysuckle as a common name. But it's not Lonicera at all. It is Dyervilla is the genus name, and Lonicera is the second name because it looks like Lonicera. Anyway, and that one's native, but I would say to keep the confusion down, don't even do that one. Find some other kind of bush. Blueberries are great if you want, like blueberries would be great plant to replace, or aronia, or to replace a burning bush, because it has that nice red color in the fall, if that's what you're looking for. So there are resources where you can say, you want something that has red foliage, and it'll tell you what. The native plant trust plant finder is fabulous, because you can say, I want our ecoregion. You can say you want it to flower in the summer. You want it to be only 2 feet tall. You want it to have, you know, you can pick a whole bunch of different categories, and it'll give you a list of the possible plants with pictures, and you can look up more about it and see. You know, so
We had a burning bush that had been there about 50 years also. It was absolutely
yeah,
huge.
and there's huge ones.
And the birds love the seeds.
Well, they do.
What
They
does
eat the
that
berries.
do to them?
Well, a couple of different things happen. One is, and I can't say for specific plants, some of the non-native plants that flower in the summer or that are fruiting in the fall when the birds are migrating, like the bittersweet, have sugary berries compared to the wild, the Virginia creeper and poison ivy. Poison ivy is a native. So if you don't have to go there, leave it there. You know, the birds don't get poison ivy and, you know, they don't get a rash from it. So leave it wherever it's possible to not have human impact on that. And then the other possible thing, that I was, whatever. So those plants have more waxy or oily fruits, which are probably more nutritious. People will argue for city places where there's something is better than nothing, which maybe is true. The problem is that if the bittersweet invades non-native, unmanaged habitat, and burning bush doesn't go anywhere. I told one of my master gardener friends, you've got this enormous burning bush, you know that's an invasive, and he said, it never goes anywhere. It doesn't sprout, you know, it doesn't cause him a problem in the garden, but it does where he can't see it go out into the rest of the world, so find something to replace it.
Well, I replaced
You did, okay. So, yeah, I know, they're all over the place, they're everywhere. And they were beautiful, if they're in the sun. The last one I took out wasn't even in a good spot for it, it wasn't getting enough sun, so it wasn't even, it was no big loss. So I dug it out and I replaced it with something else that would screen better all year. I planted an evergreen that would screen from the next house. So, other questions? Yeah,
I have lately been just loving clethra,
yes.
summer sweet.
Oh, my goodness.
It's just unbelievable. It's such a wonderful bush.
It is. And that's a plant that, that's called summer sweet or sweet pepper bush is the common name. And it's a shrub. And it's called summer sweet because it flowers in the summer in July, right? It's got this spear of white, tiny white flowers. I have a picture that has like some kind of a, like, it looks like a mosquito kind of thing on the flowers. So it's actually maybe being pollinated by a mosquito. I don't know, maybe, or something related to it. But, and it smells heavenly. So I've planted it in that bottom part of that swale thing. It does like to have some moisture. It grows along the edge of the bank of wetlands.
Yeah.
And I saw it growing in a swamp in New Jersey, and that's where I thought that it had to be, was in the swamp with its wet feet. But it doesn't. And I noticed this when I went to the dentist house, had a pond sort of down behind, and there was a trail that went down there. And I noticed as I went down the trail that all the way up the hill, here's this steep hill, there was clethra in there. It wasn't maybe flowering as much as it did at the wood, you know, it doesn't get as much sun, it doesn't flower. But it was in it, and it was there, and it was beautiful. So I said, okay, I'm gonna try planting it in my yard, and it worked. Yeah, it's wonderful.
Trim it to keep it bushy? Because the ones I have are just like a single stem that comes up.
Interesting. I don't trim them. Well, I haven't had anything for very long.
Okay.
Because I keep moving. Be settled. But anyway, okay, so, so I see it in the woods.
Yeah.
And it's a bush that's like this high.
Yeah.
And it produces vertical flowering stems. And I don't bother it. I leave it alone. In my yard, if I need to keep it under control, I think I would try the same thing I would do with other kinds of shrubs is, if it has multiple stems, take out the oldest third every year to keep it sort of in control. But I don't shape them that way. If they have something that's weird, and, you know, I'll cut that off, but.
I don't do anything to it. I just cut off dead stuff.
Does your sweet pepper bush sprout from the ground?
Yeah, they do.
Yeah, they do, they go up.
And that's what I'm hoping will happen in this. I have a bunch of them in there, but I'm hoping that the plants that I planted are gonna thicken out and make a thicket, because a lot of birds need a thicket, and birders go to thickets to try to find, you know, thick vegetation without a bush here and mulch, and a bush here and mulch, and a bush here and mulch. You know, it's like, okay. It's that thickety thing makes for natural habitat, makes for protection for the birds, for the ground nesting things. Eventually, you know, one of the reasons that grassland birds are having a problem is that a bunch of them are ground nesting birds, and we mow and mow and mow and mow, and you know, there's no way to do that. Or we plant in pieces. So if we have grassland, if you have a meadow, if you have space for a meadow, let it have native grasses tend to be bunch grasses. They clump instead of making turf. And if you have a bunch of different grasses and wildflowers in among them, that makes a great meadow. If you had a big space, like a big yard, instead of having a golf course down your yard, you could have a meadow that you mow once a year in the late winter after, if you don't want to mow it in the summer because the birds might be nesting there. Or whatever, and, just mow it once a year, and that will keep, or even every 2 years or something, that will keep the woody stuff from coming in and making it into forest. Everything here wants to be forest if it's not a wetland, but over time, you can maintain it as, open, grassy kind of place if you mow every year, every 2 years, every 3 years. Keep the woody stuff out. Question. Okay. Thank you very much for your attention. Really kind of
Thank you all for coming.
I know the farm.
He asked my grandmother, he said, can I mow your field? He said.
Thank you all.
Yeah. I did it.
Very nice.
I don't have to work.
We'll see you later.
Nothing, on my front car. You don't have to plant any box. You start.